This was a new idea, this idea that the nation or the dominion doesn't matter. It's personal salvation that matters. So personal salvation had always been part of Christianity, but you were saved into something. And everybody knew you were saved into your community and, by extension, into your nation. The West is a singularity. It is very different than any other culture. So you have to ask yourself, what makes it the West? And if you go back and look at what made it what it is, it's Christianity. The United States was a uniquely Christian nation because our Puritan roots were essentially nationalistic, because a nation can be defined different ways, but certainly the way the Puritans treated it, it was planting a nation in the United States who could live faithfully as a dominion of Jesus Christ. Kids ingest stories more readily than they ingest facts. We have seen the failure of secular government. It cannot exist because you cannot have a disconnection between the central beliefs of a people and their unity as a people.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Ideas Have Consequences. This is our happy 250th anniversary episode for our country, the United States of America, which is celebrating its 250th anniversary this week. We are both Americans, so we are very excited about this milestone for our country. We love our country, and we are happy to celebrate this 250th. For this podcast, we had a special guest join us to talk about what makes America unique. And a lot of that comes back to the education and the way we see education here in America, as Alexis de Tocqueville recognized when he came here not long after the Revolutionary War. There's something different about how the Americans are teaching their youth compared to in Europe. And a lot of what he was recognizing is how we put an emphasis on a biblical worldview that applies to all of life and all of people. And that's what a lot of our discussion is on today. But I'll let Dad, you introduce our guest in a minute. Let's hop into the intro. As Christians, we all know that our mission is to spread the gospel around the world to all the nations. However, our mission, the Great Commission, also involves working to transform our cultures so that they increasingly reflect the truth, goodness, and beauty of God's kingdom. Tragically, the church has largely neglected this second part of her mission, and today, most Christians are having little influence on their surrounding cultures. Join us on this podcast as we rediscover what it means for each of us to disciple the nations and to create Christ-honoring cultures that reflect the character of the living God. Before we hop into this today, I just want to introduce ourselves. My name is Luke Allen. I'm one of the co-hosts here on the show, also the producer, and I'm joined by my dad and our host, author, speaker, and writer, Scott Allen. Howdy, Dad.
Hey, Luke. It's great to be with you again.
Yeah, this is fun. We just hopped off a great recording with a new guest here on the show, an author that probably a lot of you are familiar with because of his books. He just had a new book come out this week, so we invited him on to share it with us. His name is David Goodwin. Dad, would you mind both just telling people a little bit more about who David is and then a little bit more about the book and the discussion that we're about to hop into?
Absolutely. Yeah, David has a brand new book that is just out this week, the week that we're recording, I should say. It's called The Forging of the American Mind, a year-by-year guide for classical Christian education. It's a follow-up book to his previous book, which was co-authored with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. The title of that book that is more well-known, obviously, because it's been out for a while, The Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation. Widely read, very influential book. He wrote that with Pete Hegseth. Before Pete Hegseth was Secretary of Defense, he was a analyst and at Fox News, basically. But just a little bit about David. Fascinating guy. He grew up in Idaho, grew up on a farm, spent more than a decade as well in business and big tech, and then later helped to found the Ambrose Classical Christian School in Boise, Idaho. Today he is the editor of the Classical Difference magazine and the president of the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which is a really significant, influential network of Christian schools, but with a focus on classical Christian education. So Dave's wife, Stormy, is also a writer and editor. They have 3 children, all of whom were classically educated. So that's a little bit about David that we're going to speak with here, Luke. Yeah.
Yeah, this was a great episode. I'm really excited to read this book. I haven't read it yet, unfortunately, The Forging of the American Mind, but I think it's probably a great book for all of us to read. It doesn't only get into education, it also just talks about what it means to disciple nations and what that looks like practically. And a lot of discipling nations, fulfilling the Great Commission, comes back to making sure that we are discipling our children and the next generations. That's a repeated theme throughout all of the Bible, is pass these things on to the next generation. And this book, I'm sure, is going to do a great job at that. It sounds like a fantastic read. I hope you guys all enjoy this episode. We got into a lot of very ideas have consequences-esque topics today, including the history of ideas that led us to this point, where modern education is pretty broken. I think we can mostly agree on that. And then how to get back. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with David Goodwin.
Well, we're so excited to have on today with us author and educator David Goodwin. David, it's great to have you with us. We're so excited to have you this week to celebrate the launch of your newest book, The Forging of the American Mind, a year-by-year guide for classical Christian education. David, thanks for joining us.
It is such a pleasure to join you. I'm grateful for the chance, and hopefully the book will be helpful.
I'm sure it will. And David, just as we begin today, I would like to have you just introduce yourself a little bit to the audience, because this is a follow-up book to a book that came out, it looks like in 2022, that you co-authored with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. The title of that book is The Battle for the American Mind, Uprooting a Century of Miseducation. That book was widely read, very influential. I noticed yesterday that it remains the #1 Amazon bestseller in the category of cultural policy. So congratulations on that great success as well. I guess what I'd like to know is what caused you to follow that book up with The Forging of the American Mind, and if you could just give us a little bit of the backstory, including what led to that first book and your relationship with Pete Hegseth. That's very interesting.
Well, these things come about through the providence of the Lord over time. In the mid-'90s, I got into classical Christian education rather accidentally. I grew up in Idaho. We're not exactly a bastion of either education or classical education, or at least we weren't in the time that I was growing up. But movement started here in the late 90s up north. I live in the southern part of the state. And one of the schools was started here, inspired by the school in Moscow, Idaho. And I early on got involved with it, eventually ran the school, and eventually developed a book that I built based on a lecture from a Hillsdale professor that talked about the early progressives in the 20th century and what their contribution to education was. I could sense there was more of a story there, so I went and did some in-depth research on that, pulling all of the magazines that the progressives had written published between about 1905 and 1920. Figuring that there would be very little about education in there. If you know the progressive movement, it made a lot of inroads into things like labor law and child labor and some unions, and it was a very socialist economic type movement. But it turned out that there were a lot of education articles in these magazines, far more than I thought there would be. Almost every week they had John Dewey or William Wirt or some progressive writing about the movement. And so I researched that in depth, turned into a book, and then I got a call in about January of 2020 from Pete Hegseth. And I typically get calls from the press because I'm the president now of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. That call was a typical press call where they want to know more about classical education. I tell them a little bit. And I did that with Pete, and at about the 20-minute mark, they're usually about done, and we wrap up and go. And then near the end, he said, well, I'm just looking for, a patriotic form of education for kids. And I said, well, classical Christian education isn't really designed to be patriotic, but it did educate all of America's founding fathers. So it is a patriotic thing, but it is not about patriotism. And he stopped for a second and said, well, you say the Pledge of Allegiance, right? And I said, well, some of our schools do, but you know that was written by a socialist. And that put him on his heels a little bit. And he said, I need to know more. So I sent him a couple of chapters of that book.
Okay.
He read the chapters and said, this story has got to get out there. I flew out to New York just in time for COVID to hit. We started work on, this was summer of 2020. Yeah. We started work on a documentary called The Miseducation of America. That became the most binge-watched documentary on Fox that year, so they wanted follow-on the next year. We did the follow-on as well. The end of the follow-on, Pete was insistent that I get the book published, but there was a shortage of paper due to
I remember that.
The COVID thing, and so it was very difficult to get a contract, even using the connections that Pete had. And so he said they'll do it if we work together on a different work that kind of combines some ideas. So I took out about half the book, which interestingly, the original book had kind of two diverging forces that had separated American education. One was the progressives, and the other was the changes that had occurred in the church in the 20th century. So the part about the church and the social gospel largely is what it was. Yeah. That part was taken out, and we did the book purely on the progressives, and that became Battle for the American Mind. We, once again, through Providence, you put the timing in about 2022, and you note that this is when parents were getting a bit itchy that their kids hadn't been in school for a very long time. So when the book came out, Battle for the American Mind, it shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list almost immediately, and stayed there for 4 weeks, I think, and then stayed on the list the whole summer. And it continues to be a strong seller, as you pointed out at the beginning of this. Because of that, they wanted to follow on. Pete was contracted elsewhere, so I took on, I asked what they wanted, and they said, hey, we've created all this demand for classical Christian education, so why don't you tell us how to do it? So what I did was when Pete and I finished Battle for the American Mind, we got to the last two chapters, and in a kind of an insider's hint about writing nonfiction is that you get to the end and you have to end it. It's not like you have a climax or something like that, right? So we get there, and what are we going to end this with? And I said, Pete, what is it that you did in the military? Because the book's called Battle, so let's talk about that. And he said, well, I was a counterinsurgency officer. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, well, I'd take little patrols through the various villages in in Afghanistan. And my job was to kind of counter what the insurgents were doing. I said, well, what's an insurgent? And he said, well, when you have a great disparity between two military forces, and the one doesn't have the military power to overcome the other, it can form an insurgency where they just basically win the hearts and minds of the people. And our job was to try and win them back. And I said, so we're essentially trying to do an insurgency with classical Christian education. That's how we decided to end the book. Well, with the book ending on insurgency, we needed an Army field guide. The new book, Forging the American Mind, is a foreword written by Pete. And that foreword talks about the Army field guide. So I'll let people read that. But that's what Forging the American Mind is. It's kind of a year-by-year guide, or what I call the field guide for classical Christian education.
Fantastic. Yeah. Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, David, about it's fascinating that, these, in God's providence, right, these things happen at the same time where you did the research, you found out about the major shifts in education in the United States, public education with the progressive movement, at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s. You were learning and becoming much more convinced that we needed to get back to the roots, the biblical Christian roots of education in our country. That was critical, and then that happened during COVID, at a time when schools were in crisis. What's happened since then with classical Christian education, or just Christian education in general? Just give us your bird's eye view of that since COVID. Is it? My sense is it's just exploded. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
It did grow rapidly. We're starting to see that growth kind of tail off a little bit. People have short memories.
Right.
But the school choice movement has come on strongly. So within the next year or two, a combination of the federal tax credit for education and in about 19 states, some amazing school choice programs that actually grant a pretty substantial amount of tuition to any parent, not just parents who are poor or in need, but pretty much universally grant it, at least to anybody of middle income. And so that could again spark the movement. And I think that it's necessary for the movement to get about 10% more share than it currently has. So if you look grossly at the 50 million school children in the United States, about 10% of them, or 5 million, are in private schools. We want to see that go to about 20%.
20%, yeah.
Yeah, which adds, quite a few more private schools. We think we'll need around 5,000 private Christian schools in those 19 states. And so the hope is that it will spark a new rise in growth, and parents and this book is really intended to help parents see why. I think probably the biggest factor for parents is that they, like me, I mean, I had the same experience. They have no ability to imagine what education can be because they've never encountered the classical Christian form.
Well, yeah, we want to get into that and talk about that because you're right. It seems like there's still, maybe before we jump into that, there still seems to be a bit of a barrier, doesn't it, with a lot of evangelicals and committed church-going Christians when it comes to the subject of education. I don't know, how can I say? There still seems to be a lot of naivete, just a lack of kind of focus on this as a really important topic, especially related to discipleship of their children. In many of the churches that I've attended, it's just not addressed. The kind of the assumption is that, it's, your kids will go ahead and go to the schools, the public schools. And many parents, I think, still kind of focus on test grade scores, college admissions, sports. What should they be focusing on instead that they're not?
Well, first off, it's hard to blame parents.
Right.
Because where else, in what other area of your life there's just an automatic enrollment in the public school, and a big yellow bus shows up and it's free, and your child goes out with every other kid in the neighborhood, gets on the bus, the state takes them away and returns them 6 or 8 hours later, and you go through that routine and you get your standard holidays every year. It's a very Marxist kind of construct when you say it the way I said it, but most parents have no idea because it's just easy. It's the way things have been.
And it's what we've known. It's what I did.
Time.
That was my experience. Exactly. We're in a bubble. You're right. We're in a bubble.
It's so funny to me. I don't know if you're following this right now, but on social media, there's all these videos of people here for the FIFA soccer games, World Cup. All these foreigners are wanting selfies with school buses because it's such an American thing, and they've never seen one. They thought they were a joke. I mean, when you think about it, just abstract yourself. This is a bus, but it's not like a bus you would find in Europe or in South America or something. It's painted bright yellow, and it has this funky flap door that opens in these weird seats where 2 or 3 kids can kind of squish together. They're not individual seats. And when you look at it, it's a very unique kind of thing. It's the largest transportation system in the world, the American public school bus system. And when you look at our education system, it's a multi-trillion-dollar institution, but at least in gross spending every year, it's as big, depending on the year, it's as big or bigger than the Defense Department. So I joke with Pete that he's got the two biggest elements right here: education and Department of War. We have to keep that Department of War. That's the new name. So in any event, I think what parents are typically lulled into is just it's so big. It's a more than $1 trillion industry. These, we have iconic yellow buses that pick up the kids. I mean, it's hard to imagine oneself not in that system. And I think for those who read Battle for the American Mind, I just did a book signing in Chicago yesterday, the day before, and yesterday, and people came up to me one after another. Your book, meaning the one that Pete wrote with me, your book changed everything for me. I pulled my kids out and I put them in, so it's like that book seemed to have caught a fire in the hearts of a lot of parents. And if you haven't read that, I would encourage you to read that one. One nice thing about doing these bestsellers is they get fairly inexpensive over time. So I think it's like around $10 in paperback right now on Amazon. So A Battle for the American Mind has mobilized a lot of parents, and we hope it mobilizes a lot more. Forging the American Mind will convince you, if you haven't been convinced, or at least I hope it will convince you, that this is a very different thing. Far from yellow school buses and 6 periods a day with bells that ring at 55 minutes and school lunch rooms with steel trays and lots of veggies and all the stuff that is school, lockers. All those trappings are really just that, they're trappings. They've trapped you into this system.
Hi friends, I wanted to invite you to help the Disciple Nations Alliance meet our $50,000 summer matching challenge. Many of you are listening to this podcast because you care about a biblical worldview, about discipling the nations, and helping Christians live faithfully in every area of life. And that's exactly what the DNA exists to do. Last year, an independent impact study confirmed what we have been hearing again and again from people around the world. The DNA's training is helping Christians break free from a compartmentalized faith to applying biblical truths to their family, work, church, community, and culture. When Christians embrace a biblical worldview, they live differently. And when believers live differently, that transformation ripples outward. Now through August 15th, your gift can help us meet this $50,000 challenge and multiply this impact. To give, just tap the link in the show notes that says Matching Challenge. And thank you so much for standing with us here at the Disciple Nations Alliance. And now for a word from our friends over at the Center for Biblical Unity.
Injustice is all around us. It can leave us feeling helpless and in despair. Can one person really make a difference and push back against the darkness? At the Center for Biblical Unity, we're passionate about equipping Christians to tackle today's cultural challenges through a distinctly biblical worldview. That is why we are launching the Ambassadors for Biblical Justice cohort. This 9-month mentoring program will walk you through the vital and practical tools you need to make a real difference in your community. Maybe you're a mother of a special needs child who has a heart to reach out to other special needs children in your local church. Or maybe you're a pastor who wants to more effectively address poverty in your community. Or maybe you're a businessman who wants to connect the dots between your vocation and your worldview. Whoever you are, if you have a heart for justice and want to explore how it aligns with the historic Christian faith, this program is for you. We are now accepting applications for our inaugural 2026 cohort. You will be mentored by seasoned Christian leaders who will help you apply biblical principles to real-world issues of justice, poverty, and cultural renewal. For more information, please visit centerforbiblicalunity.com/ambassador. Come be a part of our effort to change the world one life at a time.
Yeah, it's kind of a factory, an industrial type of system too, isn't it? Yeah. You know, one of the major themes of both of these books, I believe, David, is the idea that education isn't about information; it's about formation, formation at the deepest levels of our worldview and our life. Really, can you talk a little bit about the difference and move into what makes, in your case, classical Christian education so different, so special?
Well, The new book talks about this, Forging talks about this somewhat. Again, we take things for granted way too easily. And if you take anything away from this as a listener, don't take stuff for granted. Just clear your mind when you start reading this. The West is a singularity. There's never been anything like it in history. And some people say, well, yeah, because it's the culmination of a lot of history, the Western civilization is. But in fact, it's really not. It's only one small part of the world, and it's only pertinent, in Europe and, roughly the Americas. And of course, it's since spread throughout the world. But at its heart, the West is a singularity. It is very different than any other culture. So you have to ask yourself, what makes it the West? Well, what I say in Forging the American Mind is it's the golden thread that made the West the West. The reason why we can talk through technology and, we have cars sitting outside that we drive to and from work with, and not just that, but the reason that the nuclear family looks the way it does, the reason churches look the way they do, the reason why people, a lot of this you see in these FIFA social media posts where people are saying they leave, like stores put displays outside in front of the store and people don't steal it, right? This is all a product of the West. And Tom Holland in his great book Dominion.
I was just thinking of Tom Holland's book as you were talking there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, he makes this point. He said the West is like nothing else. And if you go back and look at what made it what it is, it's Christianity. So,
and what caused Tom, you have to get outside the bubble to do that. And Tom, as a historian, did that by looking back at Greek and Roman culture as they were actually practiced and said, it looks nothing like the modern-day England that I'm living in. So what caused the difference? I was just reading a post yesterday from a missionary in Japan, and he was saying something different. He said, Americans take for granted just how deeply shaped American culture is from the Bible in a way that like rural Japan is not, and just how much work it requires missionaries in Japan to do pre-evangelism just to make the gospel make sense, because the culture is so deeply different.
Yes, and we don't. I think you have to spend a little bit of time in other cultures to even comprehend that, but that's a whole other story. Right. So essentially what Tom Holland says is that Christianity, the dominion or the idea in the medieval age that Christianity should take dominion over the earth because that was the call of our Lord when he said he was the king. That's the call of our Lord. I take it a step further in this book and say that the real golden thread, Tom Holland is right, but the golden thread is education. And it starts in about 1000 AD. Now, there was lots of education before that, but the Roman educational system was built around developing free citizens who could debate politics and not be persuaded by a tyrant. So in some sense, that's a fairly narrow category. And that was the dominant form of education, even up through about Alcuin, who was a monk who basically educated most of England and then went over and educated Germany in the 800-900 time frame, 800 time frame, AD. And then you have this period of kind of Rome completely dying off at the end as the Muslims overtook much of Europe. Rome was kind of cast off, and everybody was fighting for their lives. And then you emerge in about 1000, and by 1100, you've got the Crusades. And so what's happening in this time frame is that education is spreading. The Muslims have been pushed back. The barbarians, like the Slavs and the Ostrogoths and all of those, have been Christianized. And so now you have ground where these people, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven.
I do remember that, yeah. It's about the Crusades, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, and the title of the movie says it all. This whole time period believed that the call of Christ was to take dominion over all the nations for the sake of the gospel and the king, right, the true king. And so they set out about doing that. And it did involve the Crusades, but the education that they put in place at the time also, they invented the university. This is something very few people realize, is that in 10,000 years of human history, nobody had a university. Now we have a university. What makes it different than, say, a court school that you would have in Persia or something prior to that? The difference was that the university aligned monastic Christian theology with worldly institutions like law, like medicine, like medicine and hospitals, like the organization of people groups into counties and into districts. All of this was done by the church. The church, fabricated out of whole cloth the way the road systems worked, and they started building. Well, Tom Holland talks about this. There's an ingredient that needs to be there that had never been there before, and that was the optimism of Christianity, that we could, by obedience to Christ, bring about the greatness of the West, that became the greatness of the West. Then, of course, much later in the Enlightenment and then with Karl Marx, Holland also points out that Marx was really a product of Christianity, a distorted project, but a project nonetheless of Christianity, because he had that same optimism. But it was a humanist-driven optimism that utopia could be created economically and in other ways by man on this earth without God. And so we've seen what that yielded. And much of the killing and death in the 20th century was the result of Marx and his ideas. But that very early idea in the Middle Ages that we can educate children to be free thinkers who align themselves with Christ, not free as in liberated to do whatever they want, but the freedom to live in Christ. And then they could take that freedom and apply it to every institution, from marriage to, like I said, government, law, and of course now we screech that that's Christian nationalism. Well, yeah, that's what it was, but it wasn't one nation. It was every nation. Every nation could be Christianized, and Christianization of that nation was the task of the church in those days, and that's how we got the West.
Well, I mean, you're speaking to the Discipled Nations Alliance here, David. That's exactly what we believe, that the Great Commission goes beyond individual salvation and has implications and ramifications for culture. We believe that's what Christ intended, and that education is absolutely central to that. But like you, I think it's far too often either taken for granted or neglected in the church. So thank you for your work to get the word out that this cannot be taken for granted any longer, and we need to reclaim that. Luke, I'd like to bring you in. I know you've got some critical questions here. What questions do you have for David today?
Yeah, thanks, Dad. Yeah, I think you're going to make a lot of people mad when you said education really began around 1000 AD, because I know a lot of people in the classical world like to point back to the Greeks when they talk about classical education. And yet I totally agree with you. I just read the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, about St. Patrick and the impact that he had on bringing the Bible into all areas of life. And as a true counterinsurgent, right, coming into the very pagan world of Ireland and then traveling from there out to, not him, but the people that followed him out into all of Europe, and essentially discipling the nations in a way that we had not seen before in history. And I think from there is probably the seedbeds for modern education. And then this is, like you said, something that Christians did well for hundreds and hundreds of years across many nations, this kind of counterinsurgency of going and making disciples of all nations through education, through all areas of life, really, until about 150 years ago, when we really came to more or less a screeching halt. That's a little bit of a broad generalization, but I'm bummed that in the Battle for American Mind, you said you took out the history about the social gospel and the impacts that made on education really downstream. Could you talk a little bit about that section that you took out? Because I do think, at least for what we do, that had huge ramifications on the optimism of the church, on the engagement of the church in society, on now our worldview as many Christians of the importance of education. A lot of that changed when we had this reaction to the social
certainly.
gospel.
So,
would you mind just unpacking
you
that
go to let's say 1750. Prior to that time, if you take all the flags of Europe, Most all of them have Christian references on them. You've got the flag of St. George, the cross of St. George is the English flag. You've got even the French flag at the time. The French flag we now have is a post-revolutionary flag. The French flag at the time had 3 fleur-de-lune elements on it for the Trinity. You go across Europe, you'll find that the fundamental assumption in 1750 was that whoever the king was of your nation, he was under King Jesus. That was just recognized universally. Any war that happened, anything that happened, had to be justified in those terms. The 30 Years' War, the War of the Roses, all these things that we hear about, and were often used as excuses for jettisoning Christianity, but they all pointed to the fact that Christ was king, and we needed to recognize that. And we have just war theory coming out of that, a lot of good stuff happening. So that's what you got going into the revolution in the United States. And the United States was a uniquely Christian nation because our Puritan roots were essentially nationalistic. It was the idea that they're in their community, their nation, they could live, because a nation can be defined different ways, but certainly the way the Puritans treated it, it was planting a nation in the United States, a nation of their people, who could live faithfully as a dominion of Jesus Christ. And so they, when they were planted here in the 1600s, were not outside of the norm. But by 1820, they found them, that idea set started to fall outside the norm. And what caused that? To your point in your question, the church in America in the 1820s, in the 1770s, let's say 1770s, 1790, right in that area, and a little before, you had the Great Awakening, right? Jonathan Edwards, Wycliffe. I mean, this was the time period where, I'm sorry, not Wycliffe.
Whitfield.
Whitfield, yeah, Whitfield. The church, the church had this Great Awakening, and by the 1820s, 1830s, the church almost wanted to spark a new awakening, and so you have the camp revival meetings, the Charles Finney, revival meetings. This was a new idea. This idea that the nation or the dominion doesn't matter. It's personal salvation that matters. So personal salvation had always been part of Christianity, but you were saved into something. And everybody knew you were saved into your community and by extension into your nation. And that made you part of the church, the universal church, as Augustine put it in the 390s or early 400s. The city of God and the city of man, they cohabitate together, but they're different things. And so it wasn't a division between a separation of church and state. It was the unity of church and state in two forms of sovereignty. And so by the 1820s, you have Charles Finney and all these new religions. Mormonism jumps up out of there, the Shakers, just all these new religions form around personal salvation. And then by the 1860s, you have Washington Gladden. Most people don't know his name, but he's probably the most influential American on the current church because he was the father of the social gospel. And the idea of the social gospel in the 1850s, 1860s was that we Christians fought too much about doctrine. We should just focus on living like Jesus lived. So what does that do? That turns Jesus into mostly a great teacher, not a king. And so when Jesus gets relegated down from king to great teacher, I don't know if you've ever been in I don't remember which chamber, if it's the Senate or the House in the Congressional building in Washington. Around the rotunda at the top, they have the great teachers of the world, and Moses and Muhammad and all of the great teachers are carved into that. And you see that, because that's about when the rotunda was built. You see that idea of Washington Gladden's, this idea that we have great moral teachers. And suddenly you've lost the authority and dominion of Jesus Christ, and you're down to basically trying to teach people how to live like Christians in a very narrow sense. Not live like Christians in a national sense, not live like Christians in a dominion sense where Christianity matters every day, but in a much narrower form. And that carried on, created the mainline denominations. That was Washington Gladden's legacy, was the creation of the mainline, not really creation of them, but the decadence of the mainline denominations, which have all gone apostate at this point. And then you have the evangelical movement, the Billy Graham movement of the 20th century carrying on Charles Finney. All of this just it's not that any of it was false, it's that it lacked a core truth that was omitted. It was like suddenly the essential nutrient that keeps us alive was taken out of our diet as Christians, and we no longer get it, so we start to decay. We don't know why we're getting sick. And that's what happened to Christendom. And so I bring that, originally in the book, I had that overlaid with then the progressives taking over instead of Christianity with regard to dominion and utopia taking over, as opposed to the kingdom of heaven on earth. And they're very different things. They sound similar, right? Both are designed to be a better future for people. As it's often said today, human flourishing is the objective. And this is one of the things I've talked a lot about with classical education. I'd like to get away from that term in classical education, because the problem with the term human flourishing is either side can use it, right? If our goal is human flourishing, either side can use that. The progressives can say that's what we're seeking with our utopia, and the Christians can say that's what we're seeking with our kingdom. So I prefer, we use the term, and I use in the book a lot, paideia, because the direct call of Scripture in Ephesians 6 is to raise our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord. That is the paideia of the Lord, is the actual literal Greek there. In the first book, we talk about how paideia is a misunderstood concept, and in the second book, I explain how and why.
That's so interesting. I hope you kept those files from when you omitted those from the Battle for the American Mind. That might need to be a future book. But this concept of paideia, tell us a little bit more about it. Here at the Disciple Nations Alliance, we always use the term biblical worldview. As far as I can tell, those terms are pretty similar. How would you describe those two
well, of course, the word
terms and maybe where they differ?
Descends to us from the German language, and it comes out of the 19th century. So it's a little bit more analytical and wooden than what the Christian cosmology, which is the word I sometimes use. It kind of means the same thing. But there's an element, and the best I can describe it is to describe one aspect. I don't know if your listeners know who Mortimer Adler was. Mortimer Adler I cite in the book, and we go through a lot. He was a great classical teacher. He developed the great books of the Western world. He does amazing work that we talk about in the new book, Forging the American Mind. And so the first edition of the great books of the West were very much in line with worldview. They were talking about ideas and how those ideas came to us through time, and what presumptions, underlying assumptions, basic premises that we think about, and how all those are shaped through our paideia, through the great raising up of those things. I think that's very worldview-ish, and I think that's where worldview is a correct but narrow term. Because when Adler, who was a secular scholar, a very profound one in his day, in 1980, so this was when he was an older man, he became a Christian. And he re-looked at that set, and he said, we missed something. It's very good at developing idea, kind of the flow of ideas and the way people think. It doesn't deal with myth. It doesn't deal with story. So when you think about it, any fact, any knowledge that you have can mean two terribly different things depending on the story that you believe. If you believe that, I was at a conference recently, and I don't want to get too egg-headed here, but the discussion was on Milton's Paradise Lost. And that story, of course, is about the fall of Eden and the actual outworking of Satan and Raphael, the angel, and Adam and Eve. And so it's a whole story about the fall. And as Christians, when we read that, who's the hero? God, right? God's the hero in the way we read the story. But the Luciferian tradition sees Satan as the hero, because he's the one in Paradise Lost who is seeking to liberate man from this tyrannical God. And which, that's why the same story can be read two ways by two different people, depending on the myth that they have deeply set in their souls. And when I say myth, I don't mean falsehood. I mean the deep set narrative in our souls. So this is what classical Christian education sets out to do. It's not just a worldview. It's a construct of a myth. And that myth is the true myth. When I say myth, I'm not talking about true or false. I'm saying it's the way we see the world. The true myth is that of creation, fall, redemption, and the rebuilding of the world in Christ. That's the true myth.
So just to clarify, so paideia is a term that you would kind of equate with this broader understanding of story, the story of reality, if you will, right? Okay,
yes.
And that's a little different from your understanding of worldview, which is, like you say, more analytic, more ideas-based, kind of presuppositions. This is a grand narrative. Is that
Yes.
Is that the way? So, and
Exactly.
how does that what, in your own words, just briefly, how does that need to shape our understanding of education, or the way we do education?
Well, because kids ingest stories more readily than they ingest facts. And those stories, the children's books like Pinocchio, like the great children's stories from the scriptures that we can draw, stories about Little House on the Prairie, or Tom Sawyer. All of these stories that we have children read in schools contribute to the myth of their general view of all of history. So we're trying to re-inject stories like the St. George and the Dragon. I mean, that was one of the central stories of the Middle Ages. It was the central story of the Middle Ages. That's why so many, the flags of St. George are from the Republic of Georgia all the way to England, all over Europe, is because that was a central myth. So we're seeking in classical Christian education to restore the myths that make the West.
And I'm hearing there too, when you talk about stories and focusing on really powerful and beautiful stories, Lord of the Rings, or St. George and the Dragon, and some of these great stories that need to be part of education, that it goes beyond. There's the three words, the logos, pathos, ethos. That paideia is it's encompassing all of that, right? It's not just logos,
Correct.
the ideas, but we're trying to reach.
Yes.
And that's what stories do, right? They touch our heart, right? That's the emotions, and the sense of right and wrong, ethos, all of it. So this is this comprehensive formation that education accomplishes, that you're trying to get at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well,
and that's why education started
If
around
I can comment on that
1000 AD,
really quick.
not
The
with the
reason we
Greeks.
make the mistake of pointing to the Greeks is that because in the late 1860s, they told us that it was the Greeks that created the West. Nobody believed that before 1860. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. No serious scholar believed that before 1860. There was Jakob Burckhardt is the one who wrote the article that just launched the idea that the Greeks and Romans are the progenitors of the West. The Greeks and Romans were respected by the medievals, and therefore they were used by the medievals. Their works were cited heavily by the medievals, but they were always Christianized. And it's if you ask, why don't we have gladiatorial games with slaves being slain and animals eating them? Why don't we have babies thrown out on the lawn and in the sewers? A lot of the civilization that we have is because the Christians Christianized Greece and Rome. So we still study a lot of that in classical Christian education. We depend on Cicero for the 5 canons of education, of rhetoric, the progymnosmata from the Greeks, and the elements of rhetoric, all these various things, but only because they were Christianized by the church.
Let's talk about the new book just briefly, as we're going to, unfortunately, running out of time. I'm sorry to say this is one of these great conversations. I would love to just keep going on. But the book is Forging the American mind. And I guess the question I'd have is, after people read this book, what habits or practices would you like to see them begin to use or successfully kind of cultivate in their understanding of education, the way they educate their children?
Well, the book is a roadmap. Parts 3 and 4 are basically a walk through K through 12. So you learn lots of techniques. They're very practical. It even shows little diagrams of how to train children, how to write cursive, right? So it touches on a lot of things. Now, you couldn't teach right out of this book directly because it's not long enough to entail all that. But it does touch on everything and give you places to research. The very last chapter of the book, I anticipate your question, which is, what do I do with this? And it's the last chapter articulates how an adult can self-educate, because most of us weren't classically educated, and it does actually list specific works to read and things to do to become a classical Christian.
Okay. And if you could say, what is one takeaway that you hope people who read your book will have after finishing it, and a practical step that they could take? Would that be it, or how would you describe that?
I hope it's a transfer. I talk in the book a lot about mental models and the transformation of the mind, and Romans 12, talking about be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's my wish for this book, is that people would be transformed as their mind is renewed and they see the world in a way that they'd never seen it before. And it's a beginning. The book is a little thicker than Battle for the American Mind, but it's really just a beginning. It's like the Army Field Guide. It will tell you the essentials of what you need to know to get started, but it isn't going to fight the battle for you. You're going to have to pick up, roll up your sleeves, and move into the territory.
Gotcha. Wow. I can't wait to read it, honestly. It sounds like such a powerful book, both of these books. I'm thinking of a parent maybe who is listening to our podcast, and they would love to have their child be join a classical Christian school, but it's difficult. Maybe they're a single parent, they can't afford the tuition. What steps could they take apart from that to begin to disciple their own children? And I'm sure this book would help them in that, right?
It certainly would. There's so many options out there today that parents. If you're a single parent and you don't have the economic means, there are a lot of these state programs are going to be helping those folks very much. There are already programs out there. ACE Scholarships has scholarships in many states that they offer to low-income kids. So don't just. It's like anything else. If you go along with the crowd and you do what everybody else does, you're going to end up where everybody else is. And there's a lot of despair out there. And these days we're tense. We're at each other's throats. It's a desperate time. And we don't want to send our kids down that same road. So take the time to do the research and see if you can find a school and see if they can give you what you enough to keep you in your school. I think there's a documentary coming out in about 6 months called American Kairos. This documentary is timed to coincide with this school choice movement in the United States. It is. I am not directly involved in it, but I was interviewed for it, and then I found out what it was, and I watched it. And it chronicles the lives of many Americans from all walks of life, from all over the country, and their experience when they lifted up the hood and found out what was going on in their public schools. And the stories are heart-wrenching. The stories are amazing. The American Kairos, keep your eye out for it. Watch that, because it will it will change the way you see America's public schools, and hopefully Forging the American Mind will give you the hope to find a school that can turn your child towards the Christian paideia.
And I think it's a good point that you're bringing up, that a lot of these schools, Christian schools, they want to make it. They're going to bend over backwards to try to help you to get your kid in and to stay in that school. There's opportunities for that maybe you need to explore. Just a quick question. I'm just curious your reaction to this, because we raised our kids homeschooled in Arizona, and just as we were leaving up here to Oregon, they implemented the program that you're talking about, where school choice was funded for everybody, essentially. And so we took advantage of that even in our last couple of years of homeschooling down there. And at the time I thought, oh, this is great. I mean, we've always paid taxes, and so we've contributed to the funding of public schools. But then we've had to homeschool our kids on our own dime, and here's a program that says, no, what you're doing is valuable and will contribute to the education of your kids publicly. I have noticed that people are becoming alarmed at that because in states like Texas and other places, Muslims, right, are taking just a lot of advantage of this to set up kind of Sharia-based schools as well. Any thoughts on that? I mean, so this is it's freedom for Christians to use state money to educate, let's say, students in a Christian worldview, but it's the same for Muslims to educate people in Islamic worldview. Any thoughts on that, David?
Well, it demonstrates the bankruptcy of pluralism, the $2 word for the idea that our government can be neutral.
Right.
It cannot be neutral. If you don't like the term Christian nationalism, then think of it as Christendom. But what I can tell you is we have seen the failure of secular government. It cannot exist because you cannot have a disconnection between the central beliefs of a people and their unity as a people. And so the problem we have with Sharia law and those sorts of things are that we have not been serious about being a Christian nation, and we need to be more serious about being a Christian nation. But in the short term, I have to say, all right, if we can build Christian schools and they build Muslim schools, I am quite confident which system is going to win, because Christ has already told us what the answer is. So let them do it, and we'll build our Christian schools. And we'll, the only danger would be if we build squishy Christian schools that try and hold on to the progressive model, but put a Bible class and a chapel into the school. We need worldview, in the term that you used earlier. What I would say is paideia. We need that to be the central purpose of all Christian schools, because that worldview will, God gave the responsibility of education to the fathers. And if you're a Muslim father, that's your responsibility no less than it is if you're a Christian father.
Absolutely.
Just so happens that, God's going to hold you accountable for how you do that, and I wouldn't want to be in the Muslims' shoes when that happens. But I think it's their responsibility, and it's the wrong thing to do to have the government try and take over the responsibility of education.
Well, 100%. One of my pet peeves is
Amen.
A lot of our Christian schools, they don't have that holistic paideia concept. So for them, Christian schools means basically a model of the public school with prayer, at the beginning, and we don't teach evolution or something like that. But they don't have a concept of, we've gotten away. The church has gotten away from this kind of full-orbed, holistic concept of Christianity. As you're right, it's progressed into this kind of personal faith kind of model. Obviously, as we always have to say, that's so important, right? People need to be born again. But we do.
Well,
go ahead, David.
What Pete and I in the book, we give the example of what the progressives did was like one of those movies where somebody steals the Hope Diamond or some great diamond, and they replace it with a piece of cut glass on the pressure plate, because the metaphor in the book was that the progressives initially replaced Jesus and the Apostles' Creed with the Pledge of Allegiance and Americanism in the early progressive schools, because people would buy that. They wouldn't have bought marks being put on the pressure plate. So what's happened now is that Christian schools have come along many years after they've stolen the real diamond, and they see this shiny piece of glass on that pressure plate, and they think, oh, we just need to polish that up a little bit because it's gotten tarnished over the years, and so we're going to take that piece of cut glass and we're going to turn it into a diamond. You'll never turn it into a diamond. It's going to be a cut glass.
Right.
That's all it will ever be, and it cannot perform the function of the diamond.
Wow. Well,
which is classical Christian education.
Amen. Well said. I love that analogy. And David, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing to help Christians and all of us kind of rediscover the diamond and build, once again, rebuild, let's just say, a distinctly Christian form of education. Thank you for all you're doing. Thanks for the books. And the new book is Forging the American Mind. I want to encourage all of our listeners to check it out, as well as David and Pete Hegseth's previous book. Both of these are so important. If you're interested in education, you've got school-aged kids, you need to understand this. It's vital. David, thanks for the time today. We're so grateful, and may God just bless you and just give you great success with the new book.
Good to be with you guys today. Good to be in the fight with you.
All right. God bless you. Take care.